Oh, we're actually live. We're actually live on Facebook.
Welcome to the link online. Well, we have news for you from a Canadian perspective, news about Canada coming to you live on Facebook here on Fridays at 14:15 hours GMT. And of course, that is 10:15 in the morning in Eastern Time. We're also heard on World Radio Paris on the shortwave service from Germany and Kauri 97.5 FM in Nigeria. That's very exciting. Hi, I'm Linda Jardin, and with me in studio is Levon Sevens.
Hello.
And we're supposed to have Terry, but he seems to have gone AWOL for the moment, so we're hoping he will join us in just a little minute. Helping us out in the control room are Marie-Claude Simard, Leo Jimeno, and Benoit, and Marc-André, and also in the dark reaches, Pierre Dutil. We'd like to say a special hello to our listeners in Nigeria on Kawi Radio 97.5, and also to our listeners via the shortwave service in Germany, Tschüss, and World Radio Paris, bonjour. And if you're listening to us in Nigeria, of course, on Kawi 97.5. Also, we just want to say right away off the top that if you have comments, we'd love to hear from you. We're live on Facebook. You can comment now, or you can always scroll to the bottom of our items on our pages and put your comments there. We'd love to hear from you. So please, please do. Coming up in this half hour, Terry has an item on spring. And I'm not sure exactly what it's about. You know, spring has officially sprung, but in parts of the country, it really doesn't look like it. So we're hoping he'll be in to talk about that. I'll be talking about a little more serious subject. You know, in the wake of that massacre in New Zealand, I'll be looking into the prevalence of extremism in Canada. And Levon, tell us about what you'll have.
And I'll speak to a marine conservation activist about the possibility of offshore oil and gas development in a corner of the Canadian Arctic that has been spared that so far.
Excellent. We'll have those and more. Please stay with us for the link online. Well, as Levon was just saying, public hearings on potential oil and gas development in the waters between Canada and Western Greenland wrapped up in Canada's northern territory of Nunavut this week. Levon, I thought there was a kind of ongoing moratorium on offshore oil and gas projects in the Canadian Arctic. What are these hearings for?
Well, you're right, Lynn. There is a moratorium right now, but it expires in 2021. And Nunavut authorities are kind of doing their homework, preparing for this day, and to see whether they would ask the federal government to extend that moratorium for another 5 years. So this latest meeting took place in Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunavut. It's in this Arctic Canadian territory. This was the last public hearing and was part of what's called a strategic environmental assessment, and it's being conducted by the Nunavut Impact Review Board. It's kind of almost like a territorial regulator. The board will now have to prepare a written report and recommendations to the federal government. And the meeting heard from a very wide variety of people, various Inuit groups, environmental groups, government scientists, all kinds of people presented to this public hearings. And the issue is this development or possible oil and gas activity in Baffin Bay and Davis Strait, which for our viewers, listeners who are familiar with the map, this is like that sliver of water that separates northeastern Canada from Greenland. And so far there hasn't been much oil and gas activity in that area for various reasons. And for more on this, I spoke with Kristin Biscay. He is with Oceans North. It's a marine conservation group based in northern Canada. And here's what he had to say.
The interesting thing is, of course, that when parties were first calling for a strategic environmental assessment, the prospect of oil and gas development seem much more imminent. And so recent market factors over the last number of years have really changed that outlook, such that we don't see presently industry pressure to develop hydrocarbons in the Arctic, and that's largely because there's really an oversupply, in particular in North America, in particular because of fracking and new methods for extracting oil and gas largely in continental North America and in the United States in particular. Mm-hmm. So we don't have as much pressure, but nonetheless, this process has continued, and it's an important process because it provides strategic planning, can provide some direction for policymakers and regulators as we go forward. And one of the things that's interesting is that this is also occurring at the same time that there's an ongoing moratorium on oil and gas development in the Arctic, mm-hmm. announced by the Trudeau government in 2016, and that was a moratorium that was called for by Nunavut NTI, the Kiksatanic Inuit Association (QIA), and the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation (IRC) when they sent letters to the federal government requesting a halt to new permits for offshore oil and gas in 2016 until a strategic environmental assessment had occurred.
This was a 5-year moratorium, and it expires in 2021. Later this year, we have, new federal elections and the possibility of another government. Or what do you see happening with this moratorium, and what would you like to see happen?
Yeah, well, certainly we believe that the current moratorium on offshore oil and gas development should not be lifted in Baffin Bay and Davis Strait, which is the subject area for the strategic environmental assessment. That moratorium should not be lifted without regional and Inuit consent. And I think if history is any indication, development proposals that for oil and gas development in Nunavut and in the Arctic to proceed too quickly without that local success have resulted in varying degrees of conflict, and that's in no one's interest, not in industry's interest, nor in the interest of local communities.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with Kristin Biscay from Oceans North Canada. It's an NGO that works on ocean conservation in northern Canada. And the interesting fact is that, this moratorium was introduced in 2016 when President Obama was the President of the United States. Of course, President Donald Trump has said that he will allow drilling in the northern or the U.S. Arctic off the coast of Alaska, and of course Norway and Russia are exploring their portions of the Arctic, and it's a huge industry for them. So we'll see whether this happens in Canada. So far, it looks like at least the Inuit in Canada are speaking out against this offshore oil and gas development. But other territories, especially Northwest Territories and Yukon, are much more keen to have oil and gas development, because that's one of the areas that they see as promises a lot of economic activity for these areas.
Thank you very much, Levon.
You're welcome.
Coming up, we'll talk about extremism in Canada. Last week's attack on the mosque in New Zealand had particular resonance for Canadians. Last week, of course, the gunmen stormed 2 mosques, killing 50 people and injuring dozens more. Horrifying in and of itself, it also brought back memories of a similar attack in Quebec City here in Canada. A gunman stormed a mosque there, killing 6 people. He pleaded guilty to the crime and is actually currently awaiting sentencing. There have been attacks on Muslims in other places around the world, prompting questions about the spread of hatred online. Canada, of course, is not exempt, and to find out more about what's going on here and the concern about it, I spoke with Amira Elega Wahby. She's a board member with the non-profit Canadian Anti-Hate Network.
Online, within a few clicks, you could amass, groups with as large as a following as 100,000 people. And online, for instance, what we saw right after this attack, on Canadian Facebook groups, we saw people celebrating the massacre, saying that Muslims deserved it, that they should expect that kind of retaliation. Of course, based on their own ignorance and misinformation and scapegoating and stereotyping of Muslim communities. So we realize that online, it's almost become acceptable to be racist, to be Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, etc. People are finding each other. Sometimes they're not even hiding their identities. They're, in fact, very proud of these viewpoints. They feel that they've got a community that will support them. And sadly, law enforcement are not able to keep up, and the social media platforms are simply not doing enough to clamp down on this type of harmful content.
What more should they be doing?
Well, that is what our elected officials should be talking with them about, and they are. But the problem is that this is big business. And so the concern is, that from a big business perspective, there's always concerns. Will they continue to operate, for instance, in our country? Will they still provide the services they do provide? And so there's always this question. The governments are grappling with how do we hold them to account. Germany, for instance, actually clamped down quite strictly on Facebook, for instance, and other social media platforms to say that we will fine you significant fines if hateful content isn't removed within 24 hours. I think that type of model should be very much looked at here in Canada as well as other governments around the world. I'm quite concerned about what's going on in Canada. CSIS, our intelligence community, only started looking at the far right very recently, in 2017, in fact. And so they've had time to mobilize and organize. We have up to potentially 300 active far right groups in this country right now. We don't have enough resources that are looking at this. We need more. We also need all levels of government to sort of work together. The Alberta government, one of the provinces here, has actually created a dedicated provincial hate crime unit. That is a wonderful step forward. We also need to see anti-racism initiatives be provided more support and resources. We need to educate people. Hate crimes in Canada are going up. The most recent statistics are that attacks against Muslims and hate crimes against Muslims has gone up by over 151%. The same year that we saw the attack on the Quebec City Mosque, very similar to what we saw in Christchurch, where 6 men were killed by a man who was consumed by the far-right hate ideologies that we're talking about. So we're seeing an increase. We're seeing a rise in this type of activity and these type of issues, and we just need a whole approach to how to deal with it at the educational level, raising awareness, educating our young people, really encouraging media literacy for how to identify fake news and misinformation. And we really need for everyday people to call out racism, Islamophobia, wherever they see it. If they see someone speaking negatively about any group or individual based on their characteristics, they should say something about it. They should educate their kids. And we have to hold each other to account.
Amira Elega Wahby has worked tirelessly on this issue, and she, of course, is by no means the only one. Canada's largest labour organisation, the Canadian Labour Congress, severely criticised the leader of the opposition, Andrew Scheer, for his immediate response to the New Zealand attack. Initially, he tweeted a comment about the shootings, but he failed to mention that the victims were Muslims. The head of the labour organisation said that by doing so, Scheer was emboldening far-right extremists. Now, a similar criticism was made by the head of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, even though Scheer had subsequently issued a longer statement saying that his Conservative Party was grieving with the Muslim community. He said that it just took too long. Scheer was also criticized for appearing at an event which was also attended by far-right personalities. And there's some concern that the politics of the right may be including some of the more extreme elements.
It's certainly, for example, a concern that's been raised in this election campaign that started in the western province of Alberta, that this United Conservative Party, this newly constituted party, has elements with some questionable far-right ties. But for me, the interesting issue is how social media plays into this, because the perpetrator of this attack, one of the things that came out, I mean, he used Facebook and other social media to live stream the attack, you know, as it was going on. And as someone who's posted, for example, stories on Facebook, for example, on gun violence and stuff like that, that often get rejected by Facebook, I find it strange that somebody posting a live video of a shooting was allowed by Facebook to go on and, you know, have it shared hundreds and thousands of times. And I mean, yes, Facebook has said that it has removed over 1 million copies of this video. But for example, I mean, we spoke about this with our colleagues from the Arab section yesterday. The Turkish president, Erdogan, has been playing this video at his rallies and using that video to kind of mobilize his own support now. So it's very interesting how social media has become almost a force multiplier, you know, using this military technology term, in terms of allowing them to sound, mobilize, to do everything that, you know, they used to do when getting together in small groups. Now they can literally broadcast their views to the entire world.
Yeah, there was an interesting item I heard on the local radio about the fact that, you know, we who have worked in radio for decades now are used to a system when we are doing live talk shows that there's a 7-second delay. And someone was suggesting, rather than streaming live, why doesn't Facebook have a 7-second delay before putting things out? So at least there could be some kind of control. But I'm guessing that the masses of information that goes through it would be very hard to manage it.
Yeah, I mean, they have almost 1 billion users, if not more.
Yeah.
So, I mean, policing that, of course, is a huge logistical challenge.
Yeah.
But, you know, Facebook, try posting any picture that Facebook finds objectionable. If there's any mention of nudity, you'll never be able to do it. But yet a video showing somebody storming into a mosque and shooting people live was somehow allowed by the system.
Yes, and as Ms. Elega Wahby said, there could be much stricter controls on extremist content as well. And she gave the example in that clip of Germany, which has basically told Facebook, you will be fined if you allow Nazi propaganda to get on your pages. And Facebook has complied. So it's not as though Facebook can argue that it just can't do it. It really needs to be the politicians who start setting some very tough rules.
Each of you guys has children that are way younger than my son. Did this, looking at the micro version, does this start with people attacking other people, maybe school students, from the safety of their basement on the media, and saying things that, if they said them in real life, they'd get a shot right in the face?
Yeah.
And so this is just what... This is what's coming out of, is that what's coming out of that?
Well, people hide behind the anonymity. There's no question that that is one of the phenomenon. I think what's more frightening, though, is just how quick the ability to assemble like-minded people is. It's stunning how fast it is, you know. Should we move on to a happier topic?
Yeah.
Spring? Okay, let's talk about spring in just a moment. So, the good news, spring has officially arrived in Canada, but Terry...
Well, that's the good news. That's the good news. Wednesday, 5:58 p.m. Being a good Canadian that I was, I looked up the forecast and it was chilly and overcast but at least it wasn't snowing. Because spring, let's face it, spring is a state of mind, right? I mean, we've read the poetry, we've read the romantic poetry, we've read, it's supposed to be smelly and scentful, and a young man's fancy turns to love. Well, well, you guys are snickering at me, but I mean, well, it's really tough in Canada. It's really tough in Canada. Now, Wednesday, they set high temperature marks in the Northwest Territories and Western Canada. Here, not so much, okay? Now, I didn't grow up here, so I never did figure out how to fill that gap between sort of basketball season and baseball season. In the States, you can just do it. The next day, you're out after the last basketball game, you're throwing a baseball around outside. Here, doesn't happen. So, you know, the willing suspension of disbelief is really needed of what's going on around you if you want to be in a spring-like state of mind. Now, I decided to call an old friend of all of ours, Bronstetter.
Oh, Dave Bronstetter.
Dave Bronstetter,
Yes.
CBC legend and native Montrealer, thinking he might be able to supply the means to develop the needed suspension of disbelief that I needed. Now, as the Beatles once said, I probably should have known better. Dave Bronstetter, this is the Spring Equinox.
My goodness, you could have fooled me. We live in Canada, or at least a small part of it. This is a huge country. In parts of it, it's like Northern California. In parts of it, it's like Southern California. Here, it's like Murmansk. So, happy equinox. But you're right, there's a lack of romance, and there's a lack of any real value in the real world as I know it. The best thing to do is to drive all night to New York.
But spring is a state of mind, Dave.
Spring really happens in this part of the world, and I must say, let's stop being complaining Canadians. When we do get it, it is short, but it is very sharp, and it's quite wonderful, but it really doesn't happen until May.
Until May, okay.
Is that
I think that's accurate.
people? Because you've got to admit the muddy part in April is kind of nice, the part that smells like dog poop and sponge, but it's a little disappointing because you have days that are quite nice, but they're rainy, and nice just means warm to a Canadian, or mild anyway.
That's right.
But beautiful, let's face it, beautiful doesn't happen in this part of the world until May. And then it's lovely. And I guess part of being Canadian is complaining about the winter, and spring means a curling briar. But I've talked to people who live in other parts of Canada. I talked to a meteorologist many years ago in St. John's, and they just keep getting snow well into May and lots of rain. So at least when it is cold at this time of year here, we get sunshine. Yesterday was absolutely, the 19th, was beautiful.
Now, I know you're sick, so you want to go back to bed, and you've had enough of doing radio your whole life. So just don't go outside and make a snow angel, okay?
Well, no. I'd never be able to pick myself up. The ice would form around me, and that would be the end of me. Or I'd fall into a big rut in the roads. The roads are lovely. And I hope I've been able to give everyone a lovely spring postcard.
Inspirational.
On the
Inspirational.
20th of March.
Thank you so much for doing this, Dave.
God bless you, too.
That's old Bronstetter. David Bronstetter, longtime CBC. We're looking at a live shot now.
Exactly. This is what Montreal looks like. And can you tell? I mean, it looks like it's rain, but it's supposed to turn into snow as the temperatures drop.
I don't think it's coming. Last night I was walking home. We were supposed to get 15 centimeters today.
Terry,
it didn't feel like it.
Terry, dream on. There are two different systems coming in, and they are going to dump. First one is going to dump 10 to 15 centimeters here in Montreal, and then another one's going to dump, 5 centimeters? And it's going to be much worse outside of Montreal. So guess what? I'm going skiing on Sunday.
Yeah,
that's
a very good idea.
You have to make hay while the sun shines.
That's
no
right.
baseball.
You got to enjoy. You got to make friends with winter. That's what they always told me when I moved up here. But
and wear wool.
It's really hard to make friends with winter if it's not in your DNA.
Well, I find what often happens in Montreal anyway, because it's a huge country and different things happen in different parts of the country, right? But in Montreal, what I find is we generally leap directly from winter
to summer.
to summer. And when the rest of the world is singing about April showers, we always get snow in April. People forget that, but we always get snow in April. But the nice thing is that it melts very quickly.
One of the, I think, most useful advice I've ever got when I moved to Canada was never dream of spring until the end of April. Just forget about spring until May. And,
That's a good point.
it helps.
Yes.
Listen, I mean, if you're used to, in your country, spring kicking in March, not a good idea. It's a recipe for like a full-blown depression when you get out of your house, and we're what, March 20?
But when does spring come in Armenia?
Depends where. Armenia is a small country, but it's also very diverse. So I grew up in the capital, which is in a mountain valley. So it's more or less March is spring. You have flowers. You start,
Oh, nice.
In the mountains where our ancestral villages, I was looking at Facebook photos. We still have snow, and in our country house we had snow banks up until mid-May. Snow banks, partially melted snow, but it depends where you are. It's a mountainous country, so high up on the mountain. I used to bribe my teachers, getting them wildflowers from the mountains. When in mid-July, when everywhere else in the country those flowers had already dried up, but because you could go up 3,000 meters and there's still snow there.
But they pay him the big bucks,
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Hey, but one thing, I mean, when I went to visit my son in California, he lives up hard by the mountains.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you can go up into the mountains, and it's it's really winter up there.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, winter. I mean, snow, everything. The whole people are skiing. And then you come down. If you go far enough, you get right back to the Pacific Ocean. Now, that's my kind of winter, like for an hour and a half.
Listen, we have this also in Vancouver. Don't forget. You can drive 20 minutes from Vancouver to Blackcomb to Whistler, and you can go skiing. And when the weather gets really nice in May, they still have a decent snowpack in spite of climate change, and there are people who ski in their shorts. So I mean, that's what I'd like to do when I grow up, and it's beautiful too, because 20 minutes later you go down to the coast where it's nice and warm, and
I like
you can
that
walk.
idea. That's a great concept.
Yeah.
Well, all you have to do is
get enough money to live in California,
or British Columbia.
Well, who can afford a house in BC? Not me. Huh.
Well, all right, that's it for us today. We want to thank everybody who is with us. I'm Lynn Desjardins, and of course with me, Terry. Finally managed to come. Terry Haig, 11-on-7.
Running the halls.
Also want to thank everyone in studio, Pierre Dutil, Marie-Claude Simard, and of course Benoit, Marc, and Leo Jimeno. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you next week. And, I forgot to say, if you want to see any of the longer interviews, make sure you go to the site. You can find all of our stories there and read them. We also have links to other stories and other information. And I'll be back here next week hosting. I'm sitting in for Mark Montgomery, who's somewhere on vacation.
Like riding a bike. She is a former television star, and she has not forgotten it at all. Wow.
Have a good week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.